What is up, guys? Welcome back to Read and React. I'm Logan Campbell, and today we're going to be going over my favorite running back values for the 2026 season that are sure to win you your leagues. Now, we did the running backs on Monday. Check out that video if you haven't already, by the way. And I kind of went into what I define value as, but just for a brief refresher, value in drafts to me is determined by where a player is being drafted relative to their range of outcomes. So, in this context, we're not just looking at ADP. It matters, but it is not the end all be all. The reason for this is that once you get further down into the positional rankings, the margin between players becomes a lot slimmer. So, for example, last year, wide receiver 20 finished 1 point per game ahead of wide receiver 30, and wide receiver 30 finished 1 point per game ahead of wide receiver 40. If you're doing some quick math there, and if you went to kindergarten, that means that there was only 2 points per game separating wide receiver 20 and wide receiver 40, give or take half a point if you really want to get that granular. But what this means is that there is not that significant of a margin between those positions. So you may draft a guy at wide receiver 32 who finishes wide receiver 30, but realistically, that's only a zero point 0.1 to zero point 0.2 point difference in terms of points per game. So what we're looking for is the guys who are going to contribute on a week to week basis and give you those spike weeks that can really help you win your leagues when you're playing them on flex at a bye week, or if a guy makes the jump from a flex play to a wide receiver 2. That's what we're looking at here because that is really what value is. To me, what you look for isn't the guys who are wide receiver 50 and have a chance at finishing wide receiver 1. Because quite frankly, they don't exist. I hate when people in the offseason are saying, oh, this guy has a chance to finish as the wide receiver 1 overall. Because realistically, once you get outside of the top 12 to 15, no players have the chance to finish number 1 overall, let alone even top 3 or top 5 once you get outside of realistically the top 24. So, with that in mind, what I look for in value is, can a player make the jump to that next tier? Can a guy go from a 12 point per game flex play to a 15 point per game wide receiver 2? Or can a guy go from a 10 point per game bench player to a 12 to 13 point flex play? Because that's who's going to win you your league, because what it does is it allows you to take better players at the other positions. So, what I look for at wide receiver to find value in players, there's a few different indicators that we see year over year. Number one is wide receivers on good offenses with high passing volume. This is the year over year T. Higgins and last year George Pickens, where you see guys on these elite passing offenses who, are they getting the bulk of their targets, of their team's targets? No, but they still are able to put together very solid wide receiver finishes due to the high passing volume and quality of the offense. Another thing is young players who have performed in past years and could be a wide receiver 1 on an above average offense. And by wide receiver 1, I don't mean a top 5 finishing wide receiver. I mean, can they be the primary target earner on their team? So last year, that was Zay Flowers. I think he jumped something like 16 spots from 2024 to 2025, and he became a solid wide receiver 1 lead target getter on an above average offense. And typically, we see this from guys in year 2 or 3. Sometimes you get the late year 4 breakout, but that's kind of the age range you're looking at, is those younger, less established guys. Now, another thing that kind of goes hand in hand with the young players is hot finishers from the previous year. So guys who maybe finished the last 5 or 6 games on an absolute tear, averaging, 5 to 8 points per game above what they did the rest of the season. This is what happened with Amon-Ra St. Brown, I believe his rookie season. Hit the last 5 games, he averaged a crazy amount of points compared to the rest of the season, and from there, he only built upon it, got that year 2 and year 3 breakout, and now is an established wide receiver. So, again, the young player and the hot finisher kind of go hand in hand, but you do get the occasional hot finisher who isn't going into year 2 or 3. And the last one, and this is a kind of a hard thing to project, but it's just something we see in the performance, is players who are volume or touchdown dependent. And what I mean by that is guys who either get an absolute crap ton of targets on a bad offense or they're primarily short targets. This is like your Wandale Robinson, where you're just getting fed, or Devontae Adams, where you are just getting a touchdown a game and 3 catches to go along with that. And both of those guys can have value, and because of that dependence, it can push them down draft boards, allowing you to get some really good performances out of guys later on in the draft. So, just for reference here, I'm using Fantasy Pros, ECR, and ADP. So, their ADP is calculated from every platform. And so, the ADPs you'll see here may not be accurate for ESPN or Sleeper or your individual platform, but it's the conglomerate of all of those. So, keep that in mind here. If I say a player is at 50th overall, but he's going at 40th overall on ESPN and 60th on Sleeper. Well, ESPN, he's obviously an infinitely worse value. Sleeper, he's a better value. So just keep that in mind here because a lot of the times the draft board does matter because whether we like it or not, the psychology of seeing a player at the top of the board does affect where guys are drafted. So with that, let's get into our first wide receiver. So the first guy we're going to talk about here is Jordan Tyson. Currently going off the board at wide receiver 34, 73.5 overall. So you're getting him at about a wide receiver 3, maybe 4 price, depending on how you structured your draft. Now, Jordan Tyson is a rookie, but we have seen consistently rookies can have very productive seasons, especially when they're drafted high. Malik Neighbors just did it a little while ago. And before that, we saw guys like Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, all these crazy receivers go off in their first year. And Jordan Tyson has the ability to do it. If he hadn't been injured in college, I think he would have been the first receiver taken off the board because his upside is that high. If you watch this guy play in college, he's a walking highlight reel, catches everything, and can play both short and downfield. And again, he was a high draft pick. He went to the Saints, who we project to be a much improved offense and a very high volume passing offense. And realistically, Olave is the only real receiving competition. So if Jordan Tyson can receive the wide receiver 2 role and stay on the field consistently, he has a very good chance to be the team's number 2 target earner. And again, a year 2 quarterback in Tyler Shuck, who showed flashes last year, a team that went out and got Travis Etienne and just bolstered their whole offense. I think the Saints offense is going to be much improved, and I wouldn't be shocked if they finish top 12 overall this year. And you can get a very cheap piece of that and a very high upside piece because, again, Jordan Tyson, he's not going to be getting the cornerback one matchups that Olave is drawing. So he can pull out of those one on ones and just destroy the coverages. So he may be a slow starter. This is just, again, what we see from rookies. The first 4 to 6 weeks typically aren't lighted on fire numbers. But once he gets going, he has massive upside. And again, I think if he wasn't injured, he would be going up with Carnell Tate and just with kind of that more flex range as opposed to wide receiver 3 or 4. So currently, where he goes, he's being drafted around guys like Ramondre Stevenson, Michael Wilson, RJ Harvey, and DK Metcalf. And I don't know about you, but to me, he has significantly more upside than all 4 of those guys. So that's again something we're going to look at here is who is being drafted around them because it does matter because that's ultimately who you are giving up to draft these players. And that's where leagues are won. It's not won because you drafted the guys who had the best ADP. It's where you can save money, quote unquote, on a player and instead draft someone who is significantly better and ends up performing much better compared to the players drafted around them. And that's kind of the MO of finding value in drafts. So with that, let's move on to our next player. All right, the next player we're going to get into is Quentin Johnston, wide receiver 42, 96.3 overall at the time I'm filming this. Now, Quentin Johnston proved he could produce last year. He became a week 1 waiver claim, number 1 waiver claim of the week. Week 2, he became a sell high. And shortly after that, he became a drop because he fell off the face of the earth. So if you were able to sell high for Quentin Johnston and you didn't make your fantasy playoffs, I don't know what to tell you. You might just be bad at fantasy football. But regardless, he did perform for those first few weeks. It was an electric run, but he proved he could do it. And I think that that really does matter when you're looking at this offense. They went and got Mike McDaniel. All the pieces are returning to health. Quentin Johnson himself was hurt off and on last year, not playing at full strength. And so, really, the thing with this whole Chargers offense is health. It's been their problem forever because if they can all stay healthy, this is going to be a top 5 offense in the NFL. And the best part of this is you can get a piece of this offense with your 4th or 5th wide receiver pick in the 10th round, your 4th bench spot deep, and he has Justin Herbert throwing to him. They have a great offensive line. And on top of that, Keenan Allen, who was their lead target getter last year, left. So the opportunity is there. At this point, Quentin Johnson appears to be the safest candidate to be on the field in those 2 wide receiver sets, which we know McDaniel loves to run. He produced both Tyreek and Jalen Waddle in the same season. Both guys had solid wide receiver finishes. And so even if Lad McConkey does for some reason become a workhorse and a top, 12 wide receiver, that doesn't mean that Quentin Johnston doesn't have any value. Again, you're not looking for him to go to a top 10 wide receiver. You're looking for him to go from your 4th wide receiver on the bench to a viable flex or possible wide receiver 2 with weekly upside due to his amazing offense. And the best part is he goes around guys like Josh Downs, Jordan Mason, Jake Ferguson, and Jonathan Brooks. Now, I do love Jonathan Brooks. I talked about him in the RB video, but those other three guys don't have even close to the upside that Quentin Johnson does. I think if you were told that he finished as a top 24 wide receiver, it would not be shocking whatsoever. And the last 2 years, he finished as a top 40 wide receiver, and now he's being drafted wide receiver 42. So you are buying the lowest outcome possible, and it's already cheap and it's basically free. And you know what? If he ends up not playing, not producing well after 2 or 3 weeks, you cut him because that's the beauty of a lot of these guys is you're drafting them so late that you don't need them to turn out. You're basically just buying lottery tickets and hoping that, your research was right and that these guys end up taking a larger role than they are projected. So with that, I really do think he's one of the most likely candidates to go from a super late round wide receiver to a viable flex option on a week to week basis. The next player we're going to talk about is probably the worst kept secret in fantasy football this year. He finished super hot last year and I think has been one of the largest projected breakout candidates from people in the industry. And we're talking about Parker Washington, wide receiver 36, going about 79th overall. So currently you're getting him about a wide receiver 3 or 4 price, maybe a stretch flex play week one if you really value the other positions in your draft. Now, the biggest thing with Parker Washington is the ambiguity of the offense. Nobody knows what the wide receiver room is going to look like, and Parker Washington finished crazy good towards the end of that last season. He averaged 22.3 points down the stretch, and on top of that, Trevor Lawrence and Brian Thomas Jr. currently have yet to really do anything. Now, I loved Brian Thomas Jr. coming out of college. I drafted him in my dynasty leagues, drafted him in my redraft leagues. Year one, he was great. Then I had him last year, and I hated my life because it's so painful to watch such a great player run streak routes all game and basically just get in their cardio. And that's the thing with Parker Washington. He's not the downfield guy who they're sending deep every play. He's the underneath guy, the short guy, the guy that they're really going to pepper with targets. And he's essentially in the Chris Godwin role within this offense from Liam Cohen. Now, Washington is cheap. All three wide receivers are cheap, actually. So I highly recommend if you're not targeting Parker Washington, at least get someone from this offense because it projects to be very good. Trevor Lawrence did really well towards the end of last season, and if that can only improve, they are going to be a very high production offense. Parker Washington is just my favorite because I really do believe he has the highest likelihood of kind of getting that wide receiver one bulk of the role. Whereas Brian Thomas Jr., again, purely because of the history with Trevor Lawrence, I don't see that happening. And Jacoby Myers, I really don't see that happening. So Parker Washington, super cheap. He's a guy who I think could go from your first guy off the bench to a very solid wide receiver too. And again, he averaged 22 points towards the end of last year. So even if that regresses a little bit, you're still looking at a very solid 16 to 18 point wide receiver who you can get in about the eighth or ninth round. And so with that, I just think he's a really good target. He also goes around guys like Wan'Dale Robinson, Justin Herbert, Caleb Williams, and J.K. Dobbins. Wan'Dale Robinson is purely a volume guy, but he will be the wide receiver too in that Titans offense. They're not going to draft Carnell Tate and then just let him run laps out there. Justin Herbert and Caleb Williams, I do like both as players, but quarterback is a position that you can kind of tend to wait on. And J.K. Dobbins just doesn't have the upside. So if you're feeling safe at running back and you want to take a shot at your wide receiver four spot on a very high upside guy, Parker Washington is the perfect player to do that with because he's just so projected to outperform that wide receiver 36. And I know I talked about not outperforming ADP, but the thing with Parker Washington is if he does outperform it, I really do believe it will be by a wide margin. All right, the next guy we're going to hop into is Christian Watson, wide receiver 30, 64.3 overall off the board. Now, the thing with Christian Watson is he has just had his career riddled with injuries. I don't know that he has played a full season yet, but when he has been on the field, all he does is produce top finishes. Last year, he was wide receiver 21 in points per game after week 8, but this year he's being drafted at wide receiver 30. Now, again, his ADP is baking in that risk for injury, but that's just not something that you can plan on or really take into account because if he is fully healthy, he is going to be a top 20 wide receiver. Green Bay gave him a sizable extension, and on top of that, they lost Romeo Doubs and Dontavion Wicks in the offseason. So he's primed for a breakout now that the targets are going to be more consolidated. Reed and Golden are really the only targets, and kind of Tucker Craft, but coming off the injury, who really knows how amazing he's going to be, at least early on in the season. And Christian Watson is a big target who they gave the money. And that's one of the things you can look at on these teams is the players who they give the money typically end up getting used. I don't know how many times we see a player get a crazy extension in the offseason and people are questioning it. And they come out and produce. And then it's like, oh, well, duh, they paid him. So they're going to use him. It's like buying a Ferrari and letting it rot in the garage. You're not just going to spend all that money and then have the dude go out and run cardio. So again, the targets are so much more consolidated and he has such a high production upside that he has proven over and over again that he can easily be a very solid wide receiver two for your team who you get at a very low end flex price. And on top of that, he goes in about the seventh round. So he's maybe your last starter at worst. And if you get him on the bench, then you have a really, really promising prospect just sitting there waiting to break out. Currently, he goes around guys like Marvin Harrison Jr., Sam Laporta, Tony Pollard, and Carnell Tate. Carnell Tate's a rookie, hard to project. Marvin Harrison Jr. has been healthy and hasn't produced, so he's kind of the opposite of Christian Watson. And Sam Laporta, who I do love, is still a tight end kind of in that range that you're not really looking to target. And Tony Pollard is a floor play at best. So if you're looking for a high upside flex or first wide receiver off the bench, Christian Watson is your guy. He has a way more upside than the guys around him, and realistically, you just need to hope he doesn't get hurt, which is something year over year that we see is not a consistent metric that we can go by. You can't assume a guy gets hurt unless he's had crazy volume, which obviously Christian Watson has not. So the last guy we're going to talk about is someone who started off the year red hot last year, and the start of his career was red hot. He was a rookie last year who started just amazing, lit the world on fire, and then his fire got put out due to injuries of his own, injuries on his team, and just a rough offensive ecosystem for the rest of the year. Now, the guy I'm talking about is Emeka Egbuka. So, like I mentioned earlier, we love to look for the second and third year breakouts, and Egbuka is primed for it. He was wide receiver three weeks 1 through 5, and so he's shown that he can produce at a high level. If he's able to stay healthy, and if Baker Mayfield is able to stay healthy, there is no reason Egbuka cannot outperform his wide receiver 18 tag at 37.8 overall and really skyrocket into the wide receiver one conversation. Now, one of the biggest factors for this for me is that Mike Evans is gone, and Chris Godwin is what, like 35 at this point? I mean, he's basically made of dust. So Ibuka has virtually no target competition. Baker Mayfield has proven that he can produce very high quality fantasy seasons. And so if those two things are able to align and Baker's able to stay healthy and produce well, even though he doesn't get in his new contract, Ibuka can benefit from this greatly and really skyrocket his production. Overall, I believe he's a solid wide receiver two with weekly wide receiver one upside because again, if this offense gets back to where it was 2 years ago, those guys were lighting it up, and Ibuka is realistically the main and almost only receiving option that should be drawing in those targets and the touchdowns. He currently goes around guys like Garrett Wilson, Ted McMillan, Travis Etienne, and Cam Scadaboo. Now, I really like these players. They're early picks. You're supposed to like them. But to me, if you look at them, Ibuka has a big leap on all of them in terms of the overall finishing upside. I think the only one who even is close to his upside is Cam Scadaboo, who's another rookie who kind of honestly had a similar season to Ibuka, except that Scat's injury was season ending. But I already went into him on the running back video, so I'm not going to beat the dead horse. Either way, Egbuka is primed for the second year breakout that we always look for in a high quality offense with a good quarterback and very little target competition. He's going to see high volume, great quality targets, and is going to be an absolute fantasy league winner. Alrighty, there you have it. That is the 5 wide receiver values that I love in this year's draft. I truly believe at least one, if not multiple of these guys will be league winners and are going to win you guys so many of your leagues. So thanks for watching. Make sure to check in later this week for the quarterback and tight end values. And next week, we'll be getting into the values that I hate. So we'll be running this whole thing back and doing the flip side of it of the guys that I dislike at their values. So again, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time.